Hello everyone. Welcome to Scary Chronicles. I know you've come here to relax and fall asleep, so before we begin, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Also, I thought it would be fun if you let me know in the comments. Where are you watching from, and what time is it there? Now, get cozy, let your worries fade, and let's begin. Story number 1. The old game disc felt wrong in my hands, cold and slick like something dead. I ran my fingers over the faded cover art, barely making out the title, Starlight's End. It was a space exploration game I found tucked away in a box of my sister, Sarah's, things, given to me after she and her boyfriend, Mark, disappeared. Mom had called their belongings too painful to keep. Sifting through the remnants of Sarah's life, faded photographs, worn-out clothes, forgotten trinkets, sent a shiver down my spine. And then I found it, nestled amongst a pile of old cassette tapes and drawings. A memory flickered. Sarah's pale face, her whispered plea, "Promise me you won't play it anymore." But her eyes held a strange glint, a mixture of fear and something else. Something I couldn't quite decipher. Why would she give me a game she didn't want me to play? Why would she even have it at all if she was so afraid of it? Come to think of it, I hadn't seen the game since that day, the day she made me promise. It didn't make sense. I pushed the memory aside, curiosity outweighing caution. Besides, they probably just ran away together. Sarah always talked about escaping this town, about traveling the world with Mark, finding someplace where they truly belonged. Maybe she was on a beach somewhere, sipping cocktails and laughing, finally free from the boredom and expectations that suffocated her here. The thought brought a bitter smile to my lips. I dug out my old PlayStation console, its gray plastic casing gathering dust in the corner of my closet. With a trembling hand, I inserted the disc and pressed the power button. The familiar PlayStation logo appeared on the screen, followed by the game's title screen. The music, a haunting orchestral piece, sent a fresh wave of apprehension through me. I navigated through the menus, a wave of nostalgia washing over me. I selected my saved game, eager to continue my exploration of the vast, procedurally generated galaxy. My spaceship, the Stardust, materialized on the screen, orbiting a lush, green planet. Everything seemed normal, exactly as I remembered it. I engaged the thrusters, pulling away from the starting planet. I set a course for a distant star system, eager to discover new worlds. The journey took some time, the vastness of space stretching out before me. I jumped between star systems, charting unexplored territory, encountering strange and wondrous planets. A desert world with towering sandworms, a gas giant with swirling storms of vibrant colors, a frozen moon with hidden caverns of ice crystals. Each planet held its own unique beauty and secrets, and I felt a thrill of discovery with each landing. I don't know what my sister was warning me about. Seemingly, nothing was wrong with this game. It was just like I remembered it. Vast, beautiful, and full of wonder. But still, a prickle of unease remained, a whisper of doubt in the back of my mind. I decided to head back to the starting system, drawn by a strange sense of curiosity, almost a compulsion. As I approached the familiar green planet, I noticed nothing out of the ordinary. The music was its usual cheerful orchestral theme, and the planet's surface, viewed from orbit, was a vibrant tapestry of green forests, blue oceans, and snow-capped mountains. I felt a sense of relief, realizing that my fears had been unfounded. I selected a landing site near a dense forest, eager to explore its depths. Touching down on the surface, I switched to the lander module, a small, agile craft designed for planetary exploration. I navigated through the trees, the sunlight dappling through the leaves, creating an almost peaceful atmosphere. But then, I saw it. A cave, hidden among the trees, its entrance shrouded in shadow. An inexplicable pull drew me towards it, a sense of curiosity mixed with a growing unease. I steered the lander towards the cave, its dark maw beckoning me closer. As I entered the cave, the music shifted, the cheerful melody fading into an unsettling silence. The air grew heavy, a palpable pressure against my chest, and a sense of foreboding washed over me. I continued deeper into the cave, my headlights illuminating the rough, jagged walls. I noticed a vein of a rare mineral glinting in the rock face and decided to extract a sample. I activated the lander's mining laser, its beam cutting through the stone with ease. But as I continued mining, the laser began to sputter, its beam flickering erratically. The lander's systems started to malfunction. The lights flickered, the sensors sputtered, and the engine stuttered. Suddenly, the mining laser surged with power, its beam cutting through the cave wall with unexpected force. The lander lurched forward, breaking through the wall and into a hidden chamber. The screen went black. The silence was absolute, broken only by the frantic pounding of my own heart. Then, a single chilling thought echoed in my mind. What have I done? A moment later, the words appeared, stark and menacing against the black void. There is no escape. At the same time, a voice, cold and hollow, echoed through the room, seemingly emanating from the very walls themselves. There is no escape, it rasped, the sound turning my blood to ice. The TV screen erupted in a blinding flash of white-blue light, and the deafening roar of static filled the room. But this wasn't ordinary static. Each burst of noise carried fragments of sound, whispers, screams, technological noise that seemed to contain fragments of communication. Voices layered within voices, speaking in languages that hurt to hear. The static intensified, searing my eyes, burning my skin. I felt a cold dread creep up my spine, the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. Something was behind me. I could feel its presence, a suffocating weight in the air that seemed to bend the very fabric of reality. Then it touched me. Long, clammy fingers closed around my shoulders, one on each side. But these weren't human fingers. They were too long, too jointed, with a texture that was part organic, part digital, as if pixels and flesh had been merged into something entirely unnatural. The fingers tightened their grip, sending waves of information through my body. Not just pain, but pure data, streams of corrupted code that felt like memories that weren't my own. I wanted to scream, to turn around and confront whatever was behind me, but I was paralyzed, trapped in a nightmare of static and shadow. The fingers seemed to pulse, each touch revealing fractured memories. Glimpses of Sarah, of Mark, of moments that couldn't have happened, realities that twisted and merged. The last thing I saw before the darkness consumed me was the pixelated text, now burned into my vision. There is no escape. But as darkness closed in, I heard another voice, faint and distant, yet chillingly familiar. It was Sarah's voice, whispering my name, followed by a single heart-wrenching word, help. Then, everything went black. I awoke with a gasp, my body drenched in a cold sweat. The room was dark, the only light emanating from the pulsing green glow of the PlayStation's power button. The air thrummed with an unnatural energy, and the shadows seemed to writhe and twist, as if alive. I fumbled for the light switch, my hand trembling. The sudden illumination revealed my room, but it felt different, distorted, as if the very walls were closing in on me. The PlayStation was still on, the screen displaying a chaotic mess of static and distorted images. I stumbled towards the console, my mind reeling. What had just happened? Was it a dream? Or something more sinister? As I reached for the power button, a chilling realization washed over me. The game wasn't over. It had just begun. The next morning, I was determined to destroy the game disc. But it was gone, vanished without a trace. I searched the house, frantically tearing through every drawer and cupboard, but it was nowhere to be found. Days turned into weeks, and the memory of the game haunted me. But it wasn't just a memory. It was something more invasive. I began to notice strange distortions in my reality. Shadows would move when they shouldn't. Reflections in mirrors would lag a millisecond behind my movements. Technology around me began to malfunction. Phones would display impossible messages. Computers would generate code that seemed to be alive. Sleep offered no escape. Nightmares plagued me, visions of distorted landscapes, of creatures that defied description, their forms shifting and morphing, their eyes burning with malevolent intent. And always, at the heart of these nightmares, Sarah, her face a mask of terror, her voice a desperate plea for help. One night, I was jolted awake by a blood-curdling scream. It came from outside, from the street below. I rushed to the window and peered out into the darkness. There, in the middle of the street, bathed in an eerie white-blue light, stood a figure that defied description. It was as tall as the lamppost beside it, its form a living fractal of darkness that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Where a body should have been, there was only a constantly shifting mass of geometric impossibilities. Its head was an elongated oval that didn't so much exist in space as suggest the possibility of existence. The eyes were what truly terrified me. They were enormous, stretched wide like ovals, filled with a chillingly familiar human quality. But they weren't eyes in any conventional sense. They were windows, portals that showed fragments of realities. In one moment, I saw Sarah. In another, Mark. In another, landscapes that could never exist. Worlds within worlds, all contained in those impossible orbs. Below the eyes, a gaping maw filled with rows of needle-sharp teeth that weren't just physical. They were mathematical constructs, pure algorithmic precision made flesh. They seemed to represent some fundamental truth about the nature of consumption, of transformation. As I watched in horror, the figure turned its head towards me, its gaze locking onto mine. But it wasn't just looking. It was downloading me, parsing my entire existence, breaking me down into fundamental units of information. A chilling smile spread across its face, if you could call that geometrical distortion a smile. Then, a voice echoed directly into my consciousness. It wasn't sound. It was pure information. There is no escape. The words reverberated through my skull, each syllable a hammer blow against my fragile sense of reality. My breath hitched in my throat, my chest constricting with terror. I screamed, but no sound came out. The figure stepped closer, its form flickering and distorting in the dim light filtering through the window. Its eyes burned into mine, and I felt a wave of dizziness wash over me. The white-blue light emanating from it intensified, filling my vision, blinding me. I stumbled back, my legs hitting the bed, and I collapsed onto the mattress. The figure loomed over me, its hand reaching down, its claws inches from my face. I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing for the inevitable. But instead of the sharp pain of its claws, I felt a cold, slimy hand caress my cheek. It trailed down my jawline, sending a fresh wave of terror through me. Then, a voice, raspy and chilling, whispered in my ear, "There is no escape, even in your dreams." I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding in my chest. It was another nightmare, but it felt different this time. More real. More ominous. I knew then that the game wasn't just a game. It was a portal to a dark and terrifying reality, and I was trapped in it. But how? How could a game, a simple collection of code and pixels, have such power? And why me? Why Sarah? A chilling thought crept into my mind. What if it wasn't the game that was the portal? What if it was something else, something closer to home? What if Sarah was somehow involved? The memory of her warning, the strange glint in her eyes, the inexplicable fear. It all seemed to point to something more sinister than I had ever imagined. I shook my head, trying to dispel the thought. It was absurd. Sarah couldn't be the monster, could she? But another, even more disturbing thought followed close behind. What if this wasn't reality at all? What if I had been trapped in this digital purgatory all along, my memories nothing more than fabricated constructs, designed to lull me into a false sense of security? My stomach churned. I gripped the edge of the desk, trying to steady myself. I needed answers. I needed to understand. I stumbled towards my computer, the familiar glow of the screen a beacon in the darkness. But as I reached for the keyboard, a chilling realization struck me. How could I even be online? If I was truly trapped in some digital hellscape, shouldn't the internet be beyond my reach? Unless the creature, the entity behind this nightmare, wanted me to be online, wanted me to search, to seek answers, to delve deeper into its web of terror. Perhaps it was a game to it, a twisted form of amusement, watching me struggle against the inevitable. My hand hovered over the keyboard, trembling. Should I risk it? Should I venture into the depths of the internet, knowing that it might lead me further into the creature's clutches? But the need for answers, the desperate hope of finding Sarah, outweighed my fear. I took a deep breath and typed in the name of the game, Starlight's End. To my surprise, a link appeared. It was a fan forum dedicated to the game, filled with posts from other players who had experienced strange and unsettling events while playing. But as I scrolled further down the forum, I noticed something strange. There were posts from other users, seemingly unrelated to the game, that were filled with cryptic warnings and pleas for help. My heart pounded in my chest as I scrolled through the increasingly disturbing messages. A wave of dizziness washed over me, and I gripped the edge of the desk to steady myself. Was I going insane? Was this all real? Then I saw it. A post, dated years ago, with a username I recognized instantly. Space Girl. My sister's online alias. It whispers promises of escape, of freedom, of a world beyond your wildest dreams. But it's a lie. A trap. A cage of starlight and shadow. Don't be fooled by its beauty, its allure. It hungers. It craves. It consumes. It took me. It will take you too. Don't play the game. Don't say its name. Don't even think it. Forget you ever saw it. Forget you ever knew it existed. It's the only way to escape its grasp. But it's already too late for me. I can hear it calling. The static. The eyes. They're everywhere. They're coming for me. Help me. Space Girl, June 12, 2018, 11:59 p.m. The words seemed to claw at my soul, their chilling message echoing the warning Sarah had given me years ago. Her fear, her desperation, it all came flooding back to me. I could almost hear her voice, whispering in my ear, pleading with me to stop. But I couldn't. I had to find her. I remembered a comment on another forum, a cryptic message about a hidden level in Starlight's End, a place where the laws of physics break down and strange creatures roam. Could this be the key to finding Sarah? I scrolled back up, determined to find the post. There it was, along with a chilling warning. If you've lost your disc, the post read, you can still play. But be warned, once you start down this path, there's no turning back. He posted this before he even mentioned finding the hidden level. I realized, a chill running down my spine. How did he know? Was he already being influenced by the game? I hesitated, my finger hovering over the download button. Was this a trap? Was I walking into something even more sinister than I could imagine? But the thought of Sarah, trapped somewhere within the game's code, spurred me on. I clicked the button, and the download began. Hours later, with the emulator installed and the game files loaded, I launched Starlight's End. The familiar title screen appeared, but this time, there was a new option in the menu, the end. I clicked on it, and the screen went black. A cold wave of static washed over me, and I recoiled from the monitor, my skin prickling with an unseen energy. Then, two words materialized in the center of the screen, glowing with an eerie green light. Welcome. But below it, in a smaller flickering font, was another message, one that made my blood run cold. She never wanted to be found. The familiar title screen appeared, but the cheerful music was replaced by a haunting melody that seemed to claw at my soul. The image of the lush green planet was now a twisted, corrupted version of itself, the vibrant colors replaced by sickly greens and browns. The game loaded, and a new message appeared on the screen, stark and chilling against the corrupted backdrop. She's waiting for you. And then I saw her. Sarah. But her pixelated form was off. Her eyes were wider, her smile too broad, revealing teeth that seemed just a little too sharp. She stood on the bridge of the Stardust, and though her form was blocky and low resolution, I could sense the malice radiating from her. "Hello, brother," she said, her voice a digitized rasp that sent chills down my spine. "I've been waiting for you." Fear threatened to overwhelm me, but I pressed on. This was it. This was my chance to save her, to bring her back. "Sarah, it's me. We have to get out of here." Her smile widened, becoming a grotesque parody of happiness. "There is no out anymore. This is our forever now." The screen dissolved into static, and I found myself no longer in the familiar cockpit of the Stardust, but in a dark, claustrophobic space. The walls pulsed with a sickly green light, and the air was thick with the stench of decay. Sarah was there, but her form was no longer human. She was a grotesque amalgamation of flesh and pixels, her limbs elongated and twisted, her eyes huge and black, devoid of any warmth or recognition. "Don't you see?" she hissed, her voice a chorus of distorted whispers. "We're free here. free from the limitations of that pathetic world. We can be anything, do anything, become anything. She lunged at me, her claws outstretched. I screamed and tried to dodge, but it was too late. Her claws raked across my face, and I felt a searing pain, not just physical, but something deeper, something that tore at my very soul. Then, I was falling, tumbling through an endless void of static and darkness. Images flashed before my eyes, distorted memories of Sarah, of Mark, of the creature with the impossible eyes, all swirling together in a chaotic vortex. I landed with a bone-jarring thud, my vision swimming. I was back in my room, the familiar surroundings warped and distorted, the walls pulsating with the same sickly green light as the chamber in the game. Sarah was there, her form flickering in and out of focus. "There is no escape," she whispered, her voice a chilling echo of the creature's. I tried to run, to fight, but my limbs felt heavy, my movements sluggish. The static intensified, filling my senses, overwhelming me. And then, I saw it. The creature. It emerged from the static, its form towering over me, its eyes burning with malevolent intent. It reached for me, its claws outstretched, and I knew that this was the end. But as its claws closed around me, I felt a strange sense of peace. The fear, the pain, the confusion, it all faded away, replaced by a numb acceptance. I was home. I was with Sarah. Forever. The screen went black. The PlayStation's power light blinked once, then twice, and then went out. The only sound was the faint hum of the computer, its fan whirring like a dying breath. The game disc lay on the floor, its surface shimmering with an eerie green light. And as I watched, a single word materialized on its surface, etched in glowing green letters. Forever. Story number 2. I'd lived my whole life in the small, idyllic farming town of Harvest Hill, where the annual pumpkin festival is more than just an event. It's a cherished tradition that brings the entire community together. Every fall, the townsfolk gather in the town square, surrounded by the glowing red and yellow of autumn leaves, to celebrate the season's bounty and compete for the coveted title of the largest pumpkin. For years, I had dreamed of winning that prize, but this year my hopes were higher than ever. Nestled at the edge of town, my modest farmhouse is surrounded by meticulously tended gardens. Each morning, I wake at dawn, don my gardening gloves, and tend to my plants with the care and precision of a master craftsman. This year, my pride and joy was a massive pumpkin that I've nurtured from a tiny seedling into a colossal gourd. It sat in the center of my garden, its vibrant orange skin gleaming in the sunlight, and I couldn't help but feel a surge of pride every time I looked at it. However, there was one garden in Harvest Hill that always caught my eye with a mix of curiosity and unease: Old Farmer Joe's. His property, just next door to mine, was shrouded in mystery. The garden was overgrown and wild, yet his pumpkins always seemed to grow bigger and healthier than anyone else's. Joe was a reclusive, eccentric man who rarely spoke to anyone, and when he did, his words were often cryptic and unsettling. The townspeople often gossiped that he held secrets, old and dark, but of course this was all wild speculation and no one knew anything for sure. As the days grew shorter and the festival drew near, I found myself working tirelessly in my garden, determined to finally outdo Joe and claim the grand prize. The townsfolk noticed my dedication and would often stop by to admire my giant pumpkin, offering words of encouragement and praise. The excitement was tangible, and for the first time, I felt that victory was within my grasp. The day of the festival arrived with a crisp chill in the air. We were in the midst of autumn, and the town square was alive with activity, filled with stalls selling homemade pies, caramel apples, and other seasonal treats. Children ran around in costumes, laughing and playing, while adults admired the various pumpkins on display. My pumpkin, transported with great care, sat proudly among the contenders, drawing gasps of admiration from the crowd. As the judges made their rounds, carefully inspecting each entry, I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. When they finally approached my pumpkin, their eyes widened in surprise, and I saw them exchange impressed glances. After what felt like an eternity, they announced the winner. My pumpkin had claimed the top prize. The crowd erupted in applause as I stepped forward to accept the trophy. My fellow townsfolk clapped me on the back and congratulated me, their faces beaming with genuine happiness. Amid the celebration, Old Farmer Joe approached me. His weathered face broke into a rare smile as he shook my hand, his grip firm and uncomfortably tight. "Congratulations," he said, his voice gravelly and low. "You've done well this year. But remember, there's always a secret to true growth." His strange words lingered in my mind long after the festivities had ended and the crowd had dispersed. As I stood alone in my garden that evening, gazing at the enormous pumpkin that had brought me such joy, a strange sense of unease began to creep in. What did Joe mean by a secret to true growth? And why did his smile seem more like a warning than a congratulation? Little did I know, the answer to those questions would soon turn the essence of my existence upside down, revealing a dark secret that lay hidden beneath the fertile soil of Harvest Hill. My first night after the festival, I experienced fitful sleep and unsettling dreams. I kept waking up to the image of old Farmer Joe's cryptic smile and the ominous tone in his voice. By the first light of morning, all the elation I'd felt in victory had faded, replaced by a gnawing curiosity about old Joe's parting words. I was determined to get to the bottom of it, so I decided to pay Joe a visit. Under the guise of thanking him for his congratulations, I approached his property, feeling apprehensive, yet determined to find out what he meant. His garden, as always, was an overgrown mess of vines and leaves, with enormous pumpkins peeking out from the undergrowth. The sheer size of his produce, even larger than mine, seemed almost unnatural. I found Joe in the back, hunched over a patch of particularly large pumpkins. He straightened up as I approached, wiping his hands on his worn overalls. "Morning, Joe," I called out, trying my best to sound casual. "I just wanted to thank you for your kind words yesterday." Joe looked up, his eyes sharp and piercing despite his age. "You're welcome," he said slowly, as if measuring each word. "Your pumpkin was truly impressive. What brings you here?" Taking a deep breath, I decided to broach the subject directly. "I couldn't stop thinking about what you said, about the secret to true growth. What did you mean by that?" For a moment, Joe said nothing. Then, he motioned for me to follow him. We walked through his garden, the dense foliage brushing against us, until we reached an old, decrepit shed. Joe pushed open the door, revealing a cluttered space filled with gardening tools, jars of strange substances, and dusty old books. "Curiosity can be a dangerous thing," he said, rummaging through a pile of papers. "But since you've come this far, you deserve to know." He handed me an ancient, leather-bound book, its pages yellowed with age. "This," he said, "is a grimoire of sorts. It's been passed down through my family for generations. It contains knowledge that most would deem unnatural." I opened the book, my eyes scanning the strange symbols and diagrams that filled its pages. There were detailed instructions on rituals, strange ingredients, and dark incantations. My heart raced as I realized the implication of what I was seeing. "Is this magic?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Joe nodded. "Not the kind you'd read about in fairy tales, but something much older and darker. It's a form of alchemy, using the natural world to bend nature to your will. My pumpkins thrive because of these rituals, but they come at a cost." "What cost?" I asked, feeling a chill run down my spine. Joe's expression grew grave. "The soil here is enriched with more than just nutrients. It requires sacrifices, animal blood, bones, and sometimes other things. The magic demands a balance." I stared at him in disbelief, the weight of his words sinking in. "And my pumpkin? How did it grow so large?" Joe sighed. "I saw your dedication and wanted to help, so I enhanced your soil when you weren't looking. I thought it was harmless, a way to give you a taste of success. But I fear I may have set something in motion." My mind reeled with the implications. My prize-winning pumpkin, the source of my pride and joy, was the result of dark, unnatural forces. The sense of accomplishment I had felt now seemed hollow and tainted. As I left Joe's garden, clutching the grimoire tightly, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had crossed a line. The vibrant orange of my pumpkin now seemed sinister, and the whispers of the town took on a more menacing tone. The once idyllic Harvest Hill was now shrouded in a shadow of ancient secrets and dark magic, and I was at the center of it all. The true horror of my situation was beginning to unfold, and I knew that uncovering the full extent of Joe's secrets would come with a price that I might not be willing to pay. The days following old Farmer Joe's revelation were filled with dread but also undeniable fascination. I couldn't bring myself to destroy the grimoire he had given me. Instead, I spent hours poring over its ancient pages, trying to understand the arcane rituals and the nature of the dark forces at work. The more I read, the more I realized how deep and dangerous the magic was. As I delved deeper into the grimoire, I noticed strange changes in my garden. Other plants began to grow at an alarming rate, their leaves larger and more vibrant than ever before. The soil, once rich and loamy, took on a darker hue and a peculiar smell. The once comforting sounds of nature were now accompanied by eerie whispers and rustling noises that seemed to emanate from the very ground. Despite my growing unease, I continued to seek Joe's guidance, hoping to find a way to undo what had been done. Our conversations grew increasingly bizarre. Joe spoke in riddles, his eyes often glazing over as if he were communicating with something unseen. He mentioned ancient spirits of the harvest, entities that demanded offerings in exchange for their gifts. "You've tapped into something old and powerful," Joe said one evening as we stood by the garden fence. "The spirits are pleased, but they are never satisfied for long. They will demand more." "What do you mean by a more?" I asked, a sense of dread curling in my stomach. Joe's face darkened. "The rituals require balance. You must give back to the earth what you take. The larger the bounty, the greater the sacrifice." That night, I awoke to strange noises outside my window. Peering into the darkness, I saw shadows moving in the garden, shifting and twisting in unnatural ways. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. I grabbed a flashlight and ventured outside, my heart pounding in my chest. As I approached the center of the garden, the light illuminated a horrifying sight. Small animals, rabbits, birds, and even a stray cat, lay dead among the plants, their bodies seemingly drained of life. The vines of the giant pumpkin had grown thicker, their tendrils wrapping around the lifeless creatures as if drawing nourishment from them. The pumpkin, which I'd severed from its roots to take it to the festival, was now reattached to the ground. Panic set in, and I realized that whatever magic had been used was spiraling out of control. I needed answers, and I needed them fast. Desperate for a solution, I visited the town library to research the history of Harvest Hill and its connection to old Farmer Joe's family. The librarian, an elderly woman with a wealth of knowledge about the town's past, led me to a dusty archive filled with old newspapers and records. As I sifted through the yellowed pages, I uncovered stories of mysterious disappearances and unexplained phenomena dating back generations. Each incident seemed to coincide with particularly bountiful harvests at Joe's property. One article detailed the sudden disappearance of a young girl during a pumpkin festival many years ago, hinting at foul play but never proving anything. The deeper I dug, the more I realized that Joe's family had long been rumored to practice dark rituals. The townsfolk, though wary, had always turned a blind eye due to the prosperity the harvests brought. Back at home, I began to experience vivid nightmares. I dreamt of being buried alive, of roots and vines slowly constricting around my body, pulling me deeper into the earth. Each morning, I awoke drenched in sweat, the images lingering in my mind. Sarah, my wife, noticed the change in me. "You've been acting strange," she said one morning, her eyes filled with concern. "What's going on?" I couldn't bring myself to tell her the full truth. "Just stress from the festival," I lied, trying to sound convincing. "I'll be fine." But Sarah wasn't the only one who noticed. Neighbors began to comment on the unusual growth in my garden, their curiosity tinged with suspicion. I could see the unease in their eyes, the way they whispered when they thought I wasn't listening. Determined to find a way to reverse the dark magic, I began documenting everything. I took photos of the garden, recorded the strange noises, and even collected samples of the soil. My collection of evidence grew, but so did my paranoia. I felt like I was being watched, not just by Joe, but by something else, something ancient and malevolent. One night, while reviewing the footage from my garden camera, I saw a shadowy figure lurking near the pumpkin patch. It wasn't Joe. The figure was tall and lean, dressed in dark clothing, and moved with a stealthy purpose. My blood ran cold as I realized the figure was performing a ritual, chanting words I couldn't understand. The next morning, I found the pumpkin even larger, its vines more aggressive. In a moment of clarity, I confronted Joe one last time. I've seen the rituals. I know what you've done, I said, my voice trembling with anger and fear. Tell me how to stop it. Joe sighed, his shoulders slumping as if carrying the weight of centuries. You can't stop it, he said, his voice barely a whisper. The spirits are already here. The only way to appease them is with a greater sacrifice. What kind of sacrifice? I demanded, my mind racing through the possibilities. Joe looked at me with a mix of pity and resignation. You know what kind, he said. Blood for growth. Life for life. As his words sank in, I realized the true horror of my situation. The price of my success was far greater than I could have ever imagined, and the darkness I had unleashed was now beyond my control. The situation reached a horrifying turning point on a cold, moonless night. The ghostly quiet of the garden was shattered by an unsettling noise, a low hum that seemed to resonate from the very earth itself. Unable to sleep, I decided to investigate, clutching the grimoire tightly and armed with a flashlight. As I stepped into the garden, the hum grew louder, vibrating through the ground and into my bones. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the twisted vines of my giant pumpkin, which now seemed almost sentient, writhing and pulsing as if alive. My heart pounded as I moved closer, the sense of impending doom thick in the air. Suddenly, I saw it, an area of disturbed soil near the pumpkin, freshly turned and dark with moisture. Kneeling down, I used my hands to brush away the loose dirt, uncovering something that made my blood run cold. Beneath the soil were the remains of small animals, their bodies contorted in unnatural ways. Among them, a human hand protruded, the flesh pale and lifeless. A wave of nausea swept over me as I realized the full extent of the horror. This was no longer just about a giant pumpkin or an eccentric neighbor. The garden had become a graveyard, and the dark magic I had unknowingly nurtured now demanded human lives as its true price. Desperate for answers, I turned to the grimoire, flipping through the pages with shaking hands. The ancient text described a ritual of appeasement, a way to communicate with the spirits of the harvest. The instructions were clear but chilling. A sacrifice was needed to stop the dark forces, one that matched the scale of the magic used. Fueled by feelings of both fear and purpose, I stormed over to Joe's house, the grimoire clutched in my hand. He met me at the door, his expression one of grim understanding. I found the bodies, Joe, I said, my voice trembling with a mix of anger and horror. How do I stop this? Joe sighed, his face etched with lines of regret and sorrow. I warned you about the cost, he said softly. The spirits demand balance. The greater the gift, the greater the sacrifice. Tell me how to end it, I demanded, desperation creeping into my voice. Joe led me to his cluttered shed once more. From a hidden compartment, he retrieved a small, intricately carved wooden box. Opening it, he revealed a ceremonial dagger and a piece of parchment covered in ancient runes. This is the ritual of severance, he explained. It's the only way to break the bond with the spirits. But it requires a life for a life. My heart sank as I realized the implications. The life of someone I loved would have to be sacrificed to undo the dark magic that had taken hold of my garden. The weight of this knowledge bore down on me like a crushing force. Returning home, I found Sarah waiting for me, her eyes filled with concern. What's going on? She asked. You've been so distant, and the garden. It feels wrong. Torn between the need to protect her and the truth of what I had discovered, I decided to tell her everything. As I recounted the dark history of old Farmer Joe's magic and the horrific revelation in the garden, Sarah's face paled. We need to leave, she said urgently. We can't stay here. It's too dangerous. But I knew running wouldn't solve the problem. The spirits were bound to the land, and they wouldn't let us escape so easily. The only way to free ourselves was to complete the ritual, but I couldn't bring myself to suggest the unthinkable. In the days that followed, the garden's transformation accelerated. The giant pumpkin grew even larger, its vines spreading like a cancer across the property, suffocating everything in their path. The eerie hum became a constant presence, a sinister reminder of the dark forces at play. As the situation grew more dire, I spent hours each day in the library, seeking any alternative to the ritual of severance. One evening, as the sun set behind the hills, casting long shadows across the town, I stumbled upon an old, forgotten diary tucked away in the archives. The diary belonged to a woman named Margaret, who had lived in Harvest Hill over a century ago. Her entries detailed her own encounters with the dark magic and the spirits of the harvest. In her final entry, she wrote of a similar situation, describing the unbearable choice she had to make to protect her family. "My husband's life was the price I paid," Margaret wrote. "But the spirits are never truly satisfied. They always return, hungry for more. The cycle must be broken, or it will continue forever." With a sinking heart, I realized the full horror of what Joe had been trying to tell me. The ritual of severance might only be a temporary solution. The spirit's hunger could not be sated for long, and the dark magic would eventually return, demanding new sacrifices. Standing in my garden that night, surrounded by the monstrous vines and the eerie hum, I felt the weight of an impossible decision. The midpoint of my journey had revealed the true nature of the darkness I faced, and the path ahead was fraught with danger and sacrifice. In the distance, old Farmer Joe's house stood in shadow, a silent witness to the legacy of the dark magic. As I stared at the giant pumpkin, its surface pulsating with a malevolent life, I knew that the hardest part of my ordeal was yet to come. The night of the final confrontation arrived, shrouded in an unnatural darkness that seemed to swallow all light. The air was heavy with the scent of decaying leaves and the pervasive hum of the restless spirits. The giant pumpkin, now a monstrous, grotesque behemoth, dominated the garden, its vines twisting and writhing with a life of their own. Desperate to end the nightmare, I gathered the necessary items for the ritual of severance: the ceremonial dagger, the ancient parchment, and a vial of my own blood. Each item felt like a lead weight in my hands, the significance of what I was about to do pressing down on me. Sarah stood by my side, her face pale but resolute. She had insisted on being there, despite my attempts to protect her from the full horror of the situation. Her presence gave me strength, but also deepened my fear of what might come. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. I nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. The decision had been made, and there was no turning back. Together, we walked to the heart of the garden, where the monstrous pumpkin loomed. I knelt before the pumpkin, spreading the parchment on the ground and placing the dagger and vial beside it. With a deep breath, I began to chant the incantation from the grimoire, my voice shaking but gaining strength as I went on. The words felt foreign and ancient, resonating with a power that made the air around us vibrate. The vines reacted almost immediately, writhing more violently, as if sensing the impending threat. The hum grew louder, filling my ears and making it difficult to concentrate. I took the vial of blood and poured it onto the parchment, watching as the dark liquid seeped into the ancient runes, making them glow with an eerie light. As I continued the chant, I felt a presence growing stronger, an unseen force that seemed to watch and judge my every move. The final part of the ritual required the sacrifice of a life, one that had been touched by the dark magic. I had hoped that the animal sacrifices Joe had made would be enough, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. Tears streamed down my face as I raised the ceremonial dagger. I turned to Sarah, her eyes wide with fear and understanding. "I'm so sorry," I whispered, my voice breaking. Before I could act, a powerful force knocked me to the ground, the dagger flying from my hand. The vines surged forward, wrapping around Sarah and lifting her into the air. She screamed, struggling against the crushing grip of the tendrils. "No!" I shouted, scrambling to my feet and grabbing the dagger. I slashed at the vines, but more took their place, pulling Sarah towards the monstrous pumpkin. Desperation fueled my actions as I hacked and cut, my hands slick with blood from the thorny tendrils. Suddenly, old Farmer Joe appeared, his face a mask of determination and sorrow. "This is my doing," he said, his voice barely audible over the cacophony. "I have to set it right." With a swift motion, he took the dagger from my hand and plunged it into his own chest. The vines recoiled, releasing Sarah and retracting towards the pumpkin. Joe fell to the ground, blood pooling around him as he chanted the final words of the ritual. The air crackled with energy as the ground trembled beneath our feet. The giant pumpkin began to wither, its vibrant orange fading to a sickly brown. The vines shriveled and turned to dust, releasing a cloud of dark, acrid smoke. The hum intensified, reaching a deafening crescendo before abruptly stopping. Joe's body lay still, his sacrifice complete. The garden fell silent, the oppressive weight lifting as the dark magic dissipated. The spirits, momentarily appeased by Joe's selfless act, retreated into the earth, their hunger sated for now. Sarah and I stood in stunned silence, the horror of what had just happened slowly sinking in. The garden, once a source of pride and joy, was now a barren wasteland, the remnants of the dark magic leaving an indelible mark. We buried Joe next to his monstrous pumpkin, marking his grave with a simple stone. His sacrifice had saved us, but the cost had been immeasurable. As we left the garden, I couldn't shake the feeling that the spirits were still watching, waiting for their next opportunity. The climax of our ordeal had revealed the true price of tampering with forces beyond our understanding. The darkness that had taken root in Harvest Hill was not so easily vanquished, and the memory of that fateful night would haunt us forever. The ultimate confrontation had ended, but the scars it left behind would remain, a chilling reminder of the danger that lurked beneath the surface of our once idyllic town. The days following the climactic confrontation were a blur of exhaustion and grief. The garden, once the pride of my efforts, was now a desolate patch of scorched earth and withered plants. The giant pumpkin had collapsed into a decaying heap, its vibrant orange hue now a sickly brown. The oppressive atmosphere that had hung over our home seemed to dissipate, leaving a profound silence in its wake. Sarah and I struggled to come to terms with the events that had transpired. We moved through our daily routines in a daze, haunted by the memories of that fateful night. Old Farmer Joe's sacrifice had saved us, but the price had been high, and the weight of guilt and sorrow was overwhelming. News of the bizarre occurrences spread quickly through Harvest Hill. The townspeople, initially skeptical, became increasingly curious and wary. They whispered about the giant pumpkin, the strange lights, and the eerie hum that had emanated from our property. Joe's sudden death added to the sense of mystery and fear that gripped the town. One afternoon, the town council paid us a visit. They stood in our barren garden, their faces a mixture of disbelief and concern. "What happened here?" asked Mayor Thompson, his voice filled with apprehension. I hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. "There was an incident," I said slowly. "Old Farmer Joe tried to help us, but things got out of control. He sacrificed himself to stop it." The council members exchanged uneasy glances. "We've heard rumors about Joe and his family," said Mrs. Henderson, the town librarian. "Dark rumors. Is there any truth to them?" I nodded reluctantly. Joe had a knowledge of ancient rituals, a kind of dark magic. It's what caused the giant pumpkin to grow so large. But it came with a price. The council members fell silent, absorbing the gravity of my words. "We need to ensure this never happens again," said Mayor Thompson finally. "The town must be protected." Sarah and I knew we couldn't stay in Harvest Hill. The memories were too painful, the whispers too loud. We decided to sell our property and move to a neighboring town, hoping to find a fresh start away from the darkness that had consumed our lives. As we packed our belongings, I couldn't help but feel a lingering unease. The grimoire, now hidden away in a locked chest, seemed to call to me, its pages filled with secrets I could never unlearn. I debated whether to destroy it, but something held me back, the fear that the knowledge within might be needed again. On our last day in Harvest Hill, Sarah and I visited Joe's grave. We placed a small bouquet of wildflowers on the simple stone marker, a silent thank you for his sacrifice. The air was still, the oppressive presence of the spirits gone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that they were not entirely vanquished. Harvest Hill took measures to prevent a recurrence of the dark magic. The town council declared Joe's property off-limits, eventually bulldozing the decrepit shed and covering the garden with fresh soil. They held a town meeting to discuss the strange events, urging residents to remain vigilant and to report any unusual occurrences. The town slowly returned to normal, but the memory of the giant pumpkin and the dark rituals lingered. Stories and legends grew around the events, becoming a cautionary tale passed down through generations. Harvest Hill would never forget the price of tampering with forces beyond their understanding. In our new town, Sarah and I worked hard to rebuild our lives. The shadow of Harvest Hill loomed over us, but we found solace in each other's company and the fresh start we had created. We planted a small garden, careful to use only natural methods, and watched as it flourished without the taint of dark magic. But the past was never far behind. I kept the grimoire hidden, a reminder of the danger that knowledge could bring. Late at night, when the world was quiet, I would sometimes hear the faint hum of the spirits in my dreams, a chilling reminder of the darkness that still lurked beneath the surface. Our new life was a testament to resilience and the power of love, but it was also a constant struggle to keep the shadows at bay. The events in Harvest Hill had changed us forever, leaving scars that would never fully heal. In the end, we learned to live with the memory, finding strength in our shared experiences and the hope that we could prevent such horrors from ever happening again. This part of our story was a quiet one, marked by the slow but steady process of healing and the enduring reminder of the price we had paid for our brush with darkness. Years passed, and Sarah and I slowly built a peaceful life in our new town. The horrors of Harvest Hill faded into distant memories, although the scars always remained. We had a child, a bright and curious boy named Tommy, who brought joy and light into our lives. Our small garden flourished naturally, free from any dark influences. One crisp autumn evening, as we were putting Tommy to bed, he handed me a small, carved wooden box he had found while playing in the attic. My heart skipped a beat when I saw it. It was the same intricate design as the box Joe had used to store the ceremonial dagger. "Daddy, look what I found," Tommy said, his eyes wide with excitement. "It's full of old papers and stuff." With trembling hands, I opened the box. Inside were several yellowed pieces of parchment, covered in familiar runes, and a small vial of dark, dried liquid. My breath caught in my throat as I realized what it was: the remnants of the grimoire and the tools for dark rituals. Late that night, after Sarah and Tommy were asleep, I sat alone at the kitchen table, the contents of the box spread before me. My mind raced as I tried to understand how these items had followed us. Had the spirits somehow transferred their connection to our new home? Or had the dark magic never truly left me? As I studied the parchments, a familiar hum began to fill the air, soft at first, then growing louder. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized the horrifying truth. The spirits had found us, and they were growing restless once again. Suddenly, a shadow flickered across the kitchen, and the air grew icy cold. I turned, expecting to see some ghastly apparition, but instead, there was nothing. The hum, however, persisted, a constant reminder of the darkness that lurked just out of sight. Unable to ignore the growing sense of dread, I knew I had to act quickly. I retrieved the hidden grimoire and compared it to the new parchments, hoping to find a way to protect my family. As I read, it became clear that the spirits were not simply satisfied with the occasional sacrifice. They sought to bind themselves permanently to a powerful source of life, such as a child. Panic surged through me as I realized their target was Tommy. Desperate to shield him from the impending danger, I decided to confront the spirits directly. I returned to the garden, now bathed in the eerie glow of the full moon, clutching the grimoire and the ceremonial items. Standing in the center of the garden, I began to chant the incantations from the grimoire, calling forth the spirits. The ground trembled beneath my feet, and the air grew thick with a palpable energy. The vines around the garden began to stir, twisting and curling as if awakened by my words. A shadowy figure emerged from the darkness, its form shifting and indistinct. It was the same figure I had seen in the garden all those years ago, the entity that had fed on the sacrifices. It spoke in a voice that seemed to echo from the depths of the earth. "You have summoned us," it intoned, its eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. "What do you seek?" "Release my family," I demanded, my voice steady despite the fear coursing through me. "You've taken enough. Let us live in peace." The figure laughed, a cold, hollow sound. "The bond is not so easily broken," it said. "A life for a life, remember? But there are other ways to appease us." Desperate, I offered myself in place of my son. "Take me," I pleaded. "Just leave my family alone." The spirit considered my offer, its eyes narrowing. "A noble sacrifice," it mused. "But we require something more. Your life alone is not enough. You must bind your bloodline to us, ensuring that our connection endures." The full weight of the spirit's demand crashed down on me. Binding my bloodline meant condemning future generations to the same darkness I had tried so hard to escape. But there was no other way to protect Tommy and ensure his immediate safety. With a heavy heart, I agreed. "I will bind my bloodline to you," I said, my voice breaking. But spare my son and allow us to live in peace for as long as we can." The spirit's eyes gleamed with satisfaction. "So be it," it said, extending a shadowy hand. "Seal the pact." With trembling hands, I used the ceremonial dagger to cut my palm, letting the blood drip onto the ancient parchment. The runes glowed bright red, and the hum intensified, resonating through the garden and into the night. As the ritual concluded, the shadowy figure dissipated, and the garden fell silent once more. The oppressive presence lifted, leaving me drained but relieved. I returned to the house, where Sarah and Tommy slept soundly, unaware of the pact that had been made. The next morning, I buried the grimoire and the ceremonial items deep in the forest, far from our home. The garden slowly returned to its natural state, free from the monstrous growths and eerie hum. Life continued, seemingly peaceful, but I could never forget the price we had paid. Years later, as I watched Tommy grow into a bright and inquisitive young man, I couldn't help but feel a pang of dread. The spirit's hunger had been sated for now, but the pact I had made would hang over our family like a dark cloud, a chilling reminder of the darkness that lurked just beneath the surface. In the quiet moments, when the wind rustled through the trees or the moon cast long shadows across the yard, I could still hear the faint, sinister hum, a reminder that the spirits were always watching, waiting for the next chapter of our bloodline to unfold. Story number 3. Prudence was 5 minutes late to her doctor's appointment. It was Saturday morning, and she hadn't wanted to go to the doctor anyway, and she didn't want to leave her house. She wasn't a fan of doctors, and didn't like appointments. But her prescription for her thyroid medication would not be filled, the nurse had told her, unless she came in for a yearly physical. It had been 2 years, but they were not going to be lenient any longer. Prudence knew she needed it. Her brain fog was coming back, and she was getting forgetful. She felt sluggish, and her clothes weren't really fitting. Thyroid, menopause, whatever it was. It sucked. But so is life, she thought, as she walked to her car. Her moment of reflection was jarred by the incessant barking of the neighbor's dog, Kip. Kip liked to yip, they said home. Kip barked constantly, and was always outside. She knew her neighbors were at home, but she imagined they had soundproof glass. So Kip stayed outside for the world to hear, while they got respite in their home. Also, Prudence had been up late last night at book club. Air quotes intentional. They did talk about books for about 15 minutes. Usually, right before they dispersed for the night. Most of the evening was spent lamenting the day-to-day of a bunch of middle-aged ladies. While there were always laughs, and always some good gossip, these evenings didn't make Prudence as recharged as they used to. Instead, she began to fret about what they would do to her sleep cycle, and how she'd tackle her ever-growing to-do list the next morning. Prudence made her way to the clinic, and checked in with Tara, the receptionist. She noticed Tara looked different, thinner maybe, tan. She couldn't quite put her finger on it, but she quickly made her way to an exam room, the benefits of being a bit late. The nurse began her usual line of questioning, took her blood pressure, and then checked her current prescriptions. "This will just be a prick," she said, looking up, smiling, as she took a quick blood sample from Prudence's finger. Next was the doctor. Dr. Lucky was the best doctor in town, of which there were many. He was a good listener, patient, and just a good guy. When Prudence's middle son, Tony, was struggling 2 years ago with anxiety, he developed a nervous tic. It became a verbal one, and Prudence would watch in horror as he appeared to talk in tongues at times. His actions became reckless, and he'd try to touch the hot stove or run into the street. Prudence brought him to Dr. Lucky in tears, and he calmly reassured both of them. He offered a variety of treatments: therapy, medicine, wait and see. In the end, Tony began taking some medication, and within 3 days, all the issues were gone. It was like a miracle. One of her friend's sons had been diagnosed with an advanced case of MS. It was a shock, and it was tragic, really. Dr. Lucky researched a salve he could use, and after using it for a few months, Shane made a really drastic recovery. No one could explain it, but no one cared. He was saved. "I hope you're not going to ask for Ozempic," he said as he listened to her breathing. "Of course not," Prudence laughed. "Or an antidepressant. Asking for Adderall? That's the new one. That or hormone therapy. Hormone therapy isn't really even a thing. That and vitamin cycling. Nope. I am perfectly content with being slightly overweight and slightly depressed." I think that is what is normal. You're just too reasonable, Prudence. I should have known better, he said, smiling. They talked about her children, his children, busy schedules, too. Everyone was doing fine. Everything was fine. Work was work, and home was busy. The middle-age mantra. You're all set. I'll see you back in a year. For real this time. Don't make my nurse keep hounding you, okay? I know. I just get busy, and I just don't really feel like coming each year. I have an apple a day. I am fine with aches and pains. There are so many things, with work, with the kids, around the house. Things suck, but that's life. It's not a highlight reel, you know? But I will try. I will make the appointment before I leave so I can held to it. I don't cancel things that are on my calendar. If you do really want to avoid things like this, I do have another option. It is something new. My farm rep just brought it last week. She says it is completely harmless, has remarkable results, and should be completely approved and vetted within the next 6 months, he said, not looking away from his computer as he completed Prudence's chart. Prudence paused. Where was this coming from, she thought. They had just been discussing the normal aspect of growing older and growing less enthusiastic. Embracing the suck. She had been declared reasonable, for Christ's sake. No thank you, she said. I'm good. Well, fine. You know. Well, if you change your mind, call the nurse. Since I just saw you, it would be easy to set it up. Only thing is, since it's not totally approved, you wouldn't pick it up at the pharmacy. I have it here. So, you'd have to come in, but I just leave at the desk with Tara, he said, finally looking at her and smiling. Just stay reasonable. No one likes someone who doesn't do as they're told, he said, as he walked out. What an odd statement, Prudence thought. He had never spoken to her that way. Maybe she hadn't noticed it before, but Prudence thought Dr. Lucky's eyes seemed different as he said this. She had never paid attention to his eyes before, so maybe they were always that unusual shade of gray, almost silver. Maybe it was the lights. Prudence shook the thought from her mind. They exchanged their goodbyes, and Prudence left the room, setting her appointment for the next year as she passed by the receptionist's desk. So, are you going to take it? Tara asked as she handed her the prescription card. Take what? Oh, didn't he mention it? The new meds we got. I started this week, and let me tell you, everything doesn't suck anymore. Isn't that amazing? Like, I feel better, lost 10 pounds. I don't yell at my husband. I don't mind making lunches or doing laundry. Everything is just easy. And, for the first time in a long time, I actually feel good. Tara looked up expectantly. Yeah, medicine isn't really my thing. And, I don't like doctor visits. I'm good. Prudence quickly walked out to her car. She ran a few errands. There were groceries to pick up, a quick trip to the post office. She got a text indicating her prescription was ready, so she headed to the pharmacy. As she waited in line, she thought about the conversations she had had. It was just so strange. When it was her turn, the pharmacist let her know her prescription was out of stock. This has been happening a lot, unfortunately. Good news though, we checked with Dr. Lucky, and he has a substitute you can use until we get more inventory. It's the exact same as the thyroid medicine you were taking before, but it just looks a bit different and has a different name. He did say take 2 today, right away though, because you haven't been taking it for a while. We put you on autofill, too. I know things get crazy, she smiled. Well, thank you for taking care of all that. And will do, Prudence replied, sticking the bottle in her purse. Hey, they did that to me, too, an older man standing behind her said. And I love it. Best change. My arthritis is gone, he said, smiling. Oh, that's wonderful, Prudence said. But I don't have arthritis. Don't matter. It just makes everything better. She got to her car and took 2 of the small gray pills, as she had been instructed. Though she had never taken 2 pills before, aside when she probably overdosed herself if she forgot she took it, she did as she was told. She trusted Dr. Lucky, even if he and Tara were a bit off today. Plus, She had to do something about this crabbiness and shortness she was feeling. Prudence didn't like feeling this way, but she knew it was normal. Washing it down with some water, she made 2 more quick stops and headed home, mentally planning out the rest of the day, which included chores, practice, food prep, and catching up on some work. As Prudence pulled into her driveway, she noticed something strange. Kip, usually a blur of energy, sat perfectly still in their yard, staring at her car. Its eyes seemed off, dull and glassy, like it wasn't entirely there. Shrugging it off, she hurried into the house, the sense of unease lifting as she busied herself with unpacking groceries, starting laundry, and getting lunch fixed for the boys. Her phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. Change your mind yet? Prudence frowned and blocked the number. It had to be some kind of sales spam. Another text. This one from the book club girls. My head is killing me. Haven't left bed. Who's going to do all my laundry today? Not me, thought Prudence. Embrace the suck, she typed back and got a few ha-has. They were all in the same boat. That night, as she lay in bed, she dreamed of Dr. Lucky. In the dream, he wasn't in his office but standing at the foot of her bed, smiling kindly. Everything could be easier, he whispered, his voice calm but insistent. You wouldn't even notice the change. No more aches, no more pains. Just better. She woke with a start, heart pounding. The room was silent except for the faint sound of her phone buzzing. Bleary-eyed, she picked it up. Another text from a different number. It's not too late. Prudence deleted the message and tossed the phone onto her nightstand. This was getting weird. She decided to call the clinic in the morning and find out more about whatever was happening. But by morning, something else had changed. The neighbor's dog's incessant morning barking was gone. In fact, as she looked out her window, she saw Kip sitting directly next to their fence, staring intently at her. Silently. Maybe they got one of those shock collars or bark collars. A holiday miracle, she thought, as she walked into the kitchen. Her usual morning sluggishness was also gone. Prudence noticed it as soon as she stepped out of bed. Her body felt lighter, her head clearer. It was unsettling. She didn't feel like herself, though she couldn't put her finger on why. And it wasn't necessarily a bad thing. It was just different. Maybe it was that dose she took yesterday. Maybe this new medication was just better. She took her gray pill, washing it down with some coffee. Her phone buzzed again, the screen lighting up with another unknown number. You're welcome. That's when Prudence remembered Tara's words. Everything doesn't suck anymore. She stopped in her place. A chill ran over her body. Had they done something to her? Was it a trick, or worse, an experiment? She tried to call the clinic, but the line was busy. She called again. No answer. Hours passed, and Prudence couldn't shake the feeling of calm, even though she was never calm on a Sunday. Sunday scaries were real for her. She'd had them ever since she was a little girl. The strange lightness in her body turned into an eerie detachment, like she was floating through the day. Her kids noticed her distraction and were louder and more rambunctious than normal, but she let it pass. Her husband mentioned her blank stare. Prudence brushed them off. She was just relaxed, she told them. But she couldn't put her finger on it. She wasn't panicked by all this. She was actually being way more productive than she normally was. The entire thing was just strange. When she finally drove back to the clinic to talk to Dr. Lucky on Monday morning, the building was dark, the doors locked. A sign on the door read, "Closed for reorganization. Thank you for your patience." Her phone buzzed one last time. Don't fight it, Prudence. It's easier this way. Prudence's breath caught in her throat as she stared at the sign on the clinic door. Her phone buzzed again in her hand. She didn't want to look but couldn't resist. Make an appointment. We'll explain everything. XXXXXXXX. She backed away from the clinic, clutching her phone tightly, the screen still glowing with a message. Her mind raced. How could they know she was here? Was she being watched? And why her? She was just a regular person, a reasonable one, she reminded herself. Her body still felt lighter, more energized than usual. But that sensation left her feeling as though her own limbs were not entirely under her control. As if driven by a motor, she thought to herself. This evening, she couldn't sleep. Her husband had no trouble, and while she was usually annoyed by his snoring and snorting, she found comfort in knowing she wasn't alone. The sound of the wind outside resembled whispers. When she finally drifted off, the dreams returned, this time more vivid. Dr. Lucky was there again, his warm, confident smile now an unsettling mask. He stood next to her bed, holding a small vial of shimmering liquid. "Why fight it, Prudence?" he said. His voice echoed in the dream, soft yet commanding. "You don't have to struggle anymore. No one does. Be reasonable." She woke in a cold sweat, her throat dry, her heart hammering against her ribs. Stumbling to the bathroom, she splashed cold water on her face, trying to shake the lingering unease. When she looked up into the mirror, she froze. Her reflection stared back at her, but something was wrong. Her eyes, usually warm and brown, were now faintly tinted with silver, the irises shimmering in the dim light. Her hands trembled as she reached up to touch her face, as if to confirm she was still herself. The next day, Prudence called the number she was instructed to on her phone. Tara answered, cheerful as usual. "Hey, girl, did you change your mind?" Tara asked. "No, not at all. Look, I need to make an appointment. And I saw you guys moved. Why didn't anyone mention that when I was there?" "Oh, yes. I must have forgot. It's been busy, you know. And we're busy. We're about 2 weeks out. Everyone is trying to get this new medication. We're actually having to work from an old office while we fix things up at the clinic. But it's right downtown. XXX Main. Will that work?" Prudence paused. She wanted to talk to Dr. Lucky now. But she wasn't sick. And maybe this eye things was just an old age thing. She'd look that up when she got home. "No, 2 weeks works. See you then." "Sounds good. I have you down. And remember, if you do change your mind, you don't need an appointment. You can just call me, and I'll open up for you." "No, thank you." Prudence ended the call. "How are we going to make it? Bonus book club? My house? Bring wine." The next 2 weeks went quickly, and were filled with texts like this from Prudence's group. Luckily, there were no more texts from the unknown numbers. Prudence had blocked each and every one of them. Someone got her number and was having some fun, she thought, the only reasonable explanation. It was the last 2 weeks of school before winter break. Prudence's days were full of work, then activities. Concerts for the boys, sports practices, potluck prep for her husband, not to mention gift buying and wrapping, along with holiday cards. These weeks were always the worst. There was so much to do, and one couldn't even enjoy it. But this year was different. It was busy. It was so busy. But Prudence just sailed through. People at work complimented on how fresh she looked. Her clothes were fitting better, but she associated this with just running all over the place and actually taking her meds. The staff at her school raved about the ham and beans she brought, and everyone even got seconds during their own luncheon. Her children didn't complain about going non-stop. Her husband complimented her and showed his appreciation through words and his actions. He even began doing laundry and making dinner a few nights during the week. The only thing that was off, other than things not sucking, as Tara had said, was the dreams. Prudence began to dream of Dr. Lucky every night. They didn't feel like dreams. It felt like he was right there beside her bed. He wasn't, obviously, because it would wake up her husband. But it felt like he came to her each night, asking her questions, as he did in the office, requesting she give this new medication a try. By the end of the 2 weeks, these talks had taken a turn. Dr. Lucky became angry, forceful. One time, he had shaken her. "You're just not being reasonable. Prudence, you need this. Your family needs you to take this. Look how much better this break was. Just take it." In another, he smiled and put his hands around her throat. "If you won't be cooperative, then I am going to have to call someone else in. Just be reasonable, or else I won't be able to help you." She awoke each time before she succumbed to the doctor, catching her breath. She reached over to her husband, who snorted and rolled over. They were always just a dream. One would think these nights of restless sleep would start to wear on a person. But Prudence kept on keeping on, as she had started to say. They weren't pleasant, but they weren't hurting anyone. And they weren't holding her back. They were dreams. Dreams come and go. There is always a reasonable explanation for strange dreams. Just like her eyes, which continued to shimmer with a silver glow. She could explain this away as well. It was the reflection from the new lights in the sconce her husband had installed. Same in her car. The silver was probably from the snow that blanketed the ground as they endured the first cold snap of the season. Everything was able to be explained. Her appointment had finally arrived. As she approached the building, the sky looked different. It was almost as if the sun and sky were washed out. Flat, almost. That happens sometimes when the sun is low, she thought. As she crossed the parking lot, she stopped. The building, this new one, seemed to be glowing or shimmering. Metallic almost, though made of the same old brick as many other buildings in town. This stark contrast to the watercolor sky and surroundings was unsettling. It's the position of the sun, she told herself. This time, the building was unlocked, though the waiting room was empty, its lights flickering faintly. A low hum filled the air, like machinery working behind the walls. "Dr. Lucky," she called out, her voice trembling. A figure emerged from one of the exam rooms. It wasn't Dr. Lucky. It was Tara, the receptionist, but her appearance was different. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes shone with the same silvery hue Prudence had noticed in herself. "We've been expecting you," Tara said, smiling too wide, her teeth unervingly perfect. "You're going to feel so much better, Prudence. You probably already do. We thought you needed a little push. You're just so reasonable. But you've only gotten the tiny dose. Today, you get it all. Then, you're going to feel so much better. Just like the rest of us." Behind Tara, shadows moved, taking the shape of figures. Patients, nurses, all with the same silvery eyes and two perfect smiles. She saw the man from the pharmacy, smiling as he received an infusion of a silvery liquid, which shimmered and glowed in its bag, and appeared to illuminate through the man's veins in his thin, thin arms. There was her neighbor, Suzanne, who was waiting, smiling, on an exam table. As a nurse, Prudence had never seen prepped a syringe of the same silver liquid, and smiling, shut the door in Prudence's face. It appeared each of the 10 exam rooms were full, and in each, someone Prudence knew was ready to be seen. Tara came closer, trying to take Prudence by the arm. Prudence started to back up, but was stopped by a tall man dressed in scrubs, who towered over her smiling. She turned to run to the exit, which was only feet away, her pulse roaring in her ears. She realized too late that the clinic door had closed behind her with a soft, deliberate click. When Prudence got home from Dr. Lucky's, she began dinner and a load of laundry. There were moments when she felt as if she were just going through the motions, like there was some silent scream ready to leave her lips. But she helped her kids with their homework, rubbed her husband's feet, and read 2 chapters in her book club book. The laundry was done and loaded, and the boys and her husband complimented her on the dinner. There were no fights over the video games, and no eye rolls when she said it was time for bed. The feeling she had, the terror and the dread, were wrapped, tucked deep, as if enveloped in a heavy wool blanket. As she lay in bed, she grabbed her phone and texted her book club group chat. "Hey there, girlies. It's been a while. Just checking in. I've been reflecting a lot lately about how hectic life gets, especially now. But something's shifted for me. It's like this quiet clarity settled in. Everything feels lighter, easier, like a fog lifting. It's strange to explain, but I feel aligned asterisk asterisk, you know? Things just fit now. No struggle, no noise. I can finally breathe without feeling the weight of it all. There's this place, Dr. Lucky's new space. It's serene, almost surreal. No waiting, no fuss. Feels like stepping into something right. Be reasonable. Treat yourself. You deserve it." Story number 4. They say schools are places of safety, of learning, of community. Black Hollow Elementary didn't feel like any of those things. It felt forgotten, felt like something everyone agreed to abandon but never spoke about again. But I needed the work. Usually, a substitute teacher doesn't ask too many questions. But I should have. The day I arrived at the campus, the parking lot was empty except for a few faded lines. The building rose before me, a boxy relic of brick and grime. The wooden sign out front was cracked and splintered, the school's name barely legible beneath the peeling paint. A faint smell of ash hung in the air. After stepping out of my car, I checked the email again, hoping I'd gotten the address wrong. No such luck. That was the place, and as far as I could tell, I was the only one there. No lights, no movement. The silence pressed in, thick and unnatural, until the front door groaned open on its own. I froze. For a moment, the building just stared back at me, its darkened doorway inviting. It felt as if a deep breath pushed me forward. The tile inside was dull and uneven, my footsteps echoing down the long, empty hall. Dim, flickering lights cast uneven shadows on the lockers lining the walls. Some were dented and scratched. The smell of ash followed me inside, intensifying with every step forward. It stuck to the back of my throat, and I tried to push down my discomfort. The hallway stretched ahead, longer than it had looked from outside. The air felt thicker, dense enough to make my chest tighten. Down the hall, a figure appeared. A man in a gray uniform shuffled toward me, his face lined with deep creases, his expression a little too friendly. He nodded as he passed me and gestured to the left. The gesture felt odd. I followed his direction and found myself in front of a door marked 12. The number had been carved into a wooden plaque above the frame. The handle was cold under my touch, unfitting against the hall's warm, stale air. The moment the door swung open, the ash smell hit me like a wave, stronger than before. The room itself was silent. Rows of perfectly aligned desks filled the space. And in those desks sat the students. The way they were sitting, though upright, rubbed me wrong. Their faces also turned toward me at the exact same time. Saying I got goosebumps right then, and there is an understatement. Their eyes were what struck me the most. They were waiting, perhaps for something important. Watching. Every pair of eyes locked onto mine, unblinking. The chalkboard at the front of the room was clean, except for a name written in perfect cursive, Ms. Harper. My name. As unease rose in my chest, I stepped farther into the room. The door shut softly behind me, though I didn't turn to see who, or what, had closed it. I stood at the front of the classroom, staring back at the rows of catatonic children. Not a single one shifted in their seat or glanced away. I placed my bag on the worn surface as I greeted them. The wood was nicked and scratched, the edges splintered, as though it had been dragged across a floor. When I glanced up, their eyes stayed fixed on me. My pulse quickened as I turned to the chalkboard. The lesson plan was already written in precise white letters, as if they'd been printed there instead of drawn. I hesitated before speaking again. The silence was so absolute that breaking it felt wrong, like stepping into a forbidden place. My voice came out steadier than I expected. I introduced myself and gestured toward the board. The children didn't move, not even to nod. They just kept staring. The only sound in the room came from the buzzing fluorescent lights, flickering faintly, their glow casting uneven shadows that seemed to ripple along the walls. I walked between the rows of desks, trying to appear casual. Their skin had an odd pallor, not quite unhealthy but lacking the vibrancy you'd expect in kids. One girl near the back had a faint sheen on her bloodied hands. She was fiddling with a locket on a chain hanging from her neck. Completely disturbed, I asked her why her hands were bloody, but, as expected, she didn't answer. My eyes lingered on her locket for a moment before I moved toward the front of the room. The floor creaked beneath me, and for an instant, I could have sworn I heard a second creak that didn't match my steps. I stopped and glanced behind me, but the children hadn't moved. Their eyes were still locked on me. The clock on the wall ticked unevenly, its hands stuttering forward in jerky movements. The minute hand skipped before settling back into place, though I could have sworn it wasn't working at all when I first walked in. Time seemed strange here, stretched and heavy. After assessing the room, I strode back to the chalkboard and picked up a piece of chalk. The weight of it was oddly unfamiliar in my hand, but I wrote the first problem from the lesson plan, though the numbers blurred slightly as I focused on them. My mind struggled to hold onto the shapes, as if they resisted being written. Behind me, a chair shifted. It was faint, but in the silence, it felt deafening. I turned quickly, my heart pounding, but all the children were still in their seats. The girl with the locket was the only one who seemed different. Her lips were slightly parted, her head tilted just enough to look unnatural. My breath hitched, but I forced myself to move. The floor creaked louder beneath my steps as I walked toward her desk again. Her eyes didn't follow me this time, but they stayed wide, as though they were fixed on something far away. Her hands were trembling faintly, the sheen of moisture glistening like a thin layer of dew. The air felt heavier around her desk, and my chest tightened. But I just stepped back and returned to the front of the room, trying to ignore the burning sensation at the back of my neck, the feeling of eyes pressing into me. I faced the board again, staring at the lesson plan written in perfect cursive. The last line on the board, one I hadn't noticed before, caught my attention. "They will listen if you keep to the rules." The words blurred as I blinked, and when I looked again, they were gone. The bell rang, sharp and mechanical. Its shrill sound jolted me, though none of the children flinched. They stiffly rose from their desks in perfect unison. I stayed by the desk, watching as they filed out of the room without a word. Their footsteps echoed down the hall, fading into the distance until everything was silent again. I waited a moment, gripping the edge of the desk, before I slung the bag over my shoulder and walked to the door. The hallway stretched out in front of me. A cold draft seeped through the air, even though the windows were closed. I tried to shake off the unease building in my chest as I made my way toward the main doors. When I reached them, I pushed hard against the metal bar, expecting the door to swing open with ease. It didn't move. I tried again, putting more weight into it, but the door refused to budge. I stepped back and stared at it. Then panic clawed at the edges of my mind. I turned and walked briskly down the hall, looking for another exit. The windows lining the corridor caught my attention, their panes smeared with grime and streaked with pale smudges. I pressed my fingers against the glass, but it didn't move. Not even a rattle. It was as though the windows had been sealed shut long ago. The sound of a distant creak stopped me in my tracks. It came from somewhere behind me, low and groaning, like the shifting of an old wooden floor. My eyes darted to the classroom doors on either side of the hall. The faint scent of ash hung in the air again, stronger than before, sharp and bitter. It clung to the back of my throat, making it hard to swallow. I forced myself to keep moving, and the soles of my shoes scuffed against the cracked tile. The sound echoed back at me. When I reached the stairwell at the end of the hall, I glanced down. The stairs disappeared into a darkness so absolute it seemed to swallow the faint light spilling from above. A chill ran through me, but I turned and climbed up instead, hoping to find another way out on the second floor. The upper hallway was dimmer, yet the lights were flickering erratically. The lockers in it looked older. Deep scratches gouged into the metal doors marked some of them. I kept walking, passing closed classroom doors and rows of lockers, each step pulling me farther into the silence. I tried another door marked exit, shoving my shoulder into it with more force. It didn't move. The handle was cold and smooth, refusing to turn, no matter how hard I tried. I stepped back and looked around, scanning the hallway for any sign of movement. Nothing stirred, but the oppressive silence proved impossible to believe I was alone. A faint scrape echoed behind me. I turned sharply, my eyes darting to the far end of the hallway. There was nothing there, just the long stretch of flickering light and shadow. My pulse quickened, and I started walking again, my pace faster, my footsteps blending with the strange echoes that seemed to trail behind me. The next door I tried was locked, too. I rattled the handle harder than before, the metal biting into my palm. A loud creak broke the silence again, this time closer, and I froze. The sound lingered before fading into nothing. My hand slipped from the door handle, and I stepped back, my heart pounding. I glanced over my shoulder, my eyes scanning the hallway. The shadows seemed deeper, the spaces between the flickering lights stretching longer than they should. The smell of ash thickened, filling my lungs with every breath. The cold draft brushed against the back of my neck. I turned back toward the stairwell, but my path was blocked. The figure of the janitor stood there, his face obscured by the dim light. He just stood there, motionless. Neither of us moved. My breath caught in my throat, and I gripped the strap of my bag tightly, the edges of the fabric digging into my hand. The lights flickered again, plunging the hallway into brief darkness. When they came back on, the janitor was gone. I didn't wait. I turned and headed for the stairs leading down, ignoring the darkness pooling at their base. Every step echoed louder than the last, as though the sound itself wanted to catch up with me. The air felt as if filling my lungs like smoke. A door on my right stood ajar. Its faded plaque above it read Staff Lounge. I stepped inside. The room was dim and stale, its walls stained with watermarks that stretched like reaching hands. A stack of papers was spread on the table. I sifted through them, my fingers brushing against their brittle surface. Attendance sheets. Each name was familiar, the same children I'd seen in my classroom. The date at the top was from decades ago, and every name bore the same grim mark, deceased. A corkboard hung near the back wall, its surface covered in old photographs. My stomach tightened as I recognized the children again, their faces blurred and featureless, their outlines smudged like a bad memory. One photo caught my eye. A woman stood at the front of the classroom, her expression stern, her name scrawled at the bottom, Ms. Turner. Behind me, the floor creaked. I whipped around, but the room was empty. Papers on the table shifted slightly, though there was no breeze, and a faint ripple spread across the surface of the corkboard. I stepped back toward the door, but something held me in place, a weight I couldn't see but could feel everywhere. A dark stain began to spread across the ceiling, its edges jagged and uneven. It dripped slowly, black and thick, pooling on the floor below. My chest tightened as the room darkened, the corners swallowed by shadows that twisted and moved on their own. That's when I stumbled out of the room. The hallway led to a door I didn't remember seeing before. Papers were strewn across the floor, their edges burned and blackened. I knelt to pick one up. The ink was faded, but I could make out the names. More attendance sheets, all with the same grim words stamped beside them, deceased. The dates stretched back decades, repeating the same children's names again and again. My stomach churned as I scanned the list. It didn't make sense. I turned toward the far corner, where a single notebook lay on the floor. Its leather cover was charred at the edges, and its pages crackled faintly as I opened it. The first entry was neat, bearing a name I had seen before, Ms. Turner. Her handwriting grew more frantic as the pages went on, describing the children, the fire, and the way the school seemed to twist around her. The last page was a single, jagged line. The school won't let me leave. I stumbled out of the room and back into the hallway, my breath catching with every step. The walls around me pulsed faintly, and the acrid odor pressed against my lungs. I kept moving, though I didn't know where I was going. I only knew I couldn't stop. The hallway twisted, and each step forward brought me deeper into a maze that wasn't there before. The air grew heavier, pressing against my chest like it wanted to squeeze the breath out of me. The notebook weighed heavily in my hand. The leather was cool and slick, almost wet, though there was no moisture. Its pages whispered faintly as I moved. Every corner I turned revealed more of the same, endless rows of lockers, doors that wouldn't open, and windows that didn't seem real anymore. The ash smell had thickened, coating my tongue with its bitter tang. I wiped my mouth on my sleeve, but the taste lingered. I pressed forward, drawn by a pull I couldn't understand. The notebook had become something more than an object. It felt alive, the heat of it radiating into my palm as if it knew what was waiting for me. The shadows in the corners of the hallway seemed to stretch and move, though I never saw them shift directly. They lingered just out of view, hinting at shapes that didn't belong in this world. The floor beneath me groaned, the sound low and uneven, like a great weight pushed against it from below. A draft slid past me, carrying the faintest echo of a whisper. I stopped and turned, but the hallway behind me was empty. A sharp crack broke the silence, splitting the air like a whip. I froze, my grip on the notebook tightening. A line snaked its way across the ceiling as its jagged edges glowed orange. The sound boomed as another crack branched out from the first. The ceiling trembled above me, small fragments of plaster raining down as the cracks widened and spread. As my footsteps pounded against tile, the hallway stretched farther with each step. No matter how fast I moved, the end of the corridor always remained just out of reach. The lights overhead flickered faster, their buzzing growing louder until it became a high-pitched whine. The ground beneath me shuddered, and I stumbled, catching myself against a row of lockers. The metal was warm, and I jerked my hand away. The surface of the lockers rippled, the warped metal shifting as though something inside was pushing against it. The shadows at the edges of the hallway surged forward, swallowing the light and leaving me in near darkness. I forced myself to move, dragging my feet forward even as the ground seemed to fight against me. The air grew colder, biting into my skin with every breath, and the smoky air was so thick it burned my throat. The hallway around me groaned like a living thing, the walls pulsating with a faint, irregular rhythm. Ahead, a doorway appeared, its frame glowing faintly in the darkness. It shouldn't have been there before, since I had passed that very hallway earlier. The glow pulsed, drawing me closer, despite the dread clawing at my stomach. The notebook grew hotter in my hand, its weight pulling me forward even as my legs resisted. I stepped through the doorway and found myself in a room unlike any I'd seen before. The walls were lined with mirrors, their surfaces dull and warped, reflecting faint, distorted images of the hall behind me. The air in the room was cold, colder than anywhere else in the school, and each breath left a faint mist hanging in the air. At the center of the room stood an old, scarred desk. A single chair sat behind it, its wooden frame splintered and worn. The light in the room came from no visible source, casting long shadows across the floor that seemed to shift and crawl on their own. The notebook grew heavier, and I set it down on the desk. The moment it left my grip, the pages began to flutter. The faint sound of the paper rustling filled the room, growing louder and sharper until it became an unbearable screech. The mirrors on the walls rippled like water. One by one, the mirrors darkened, their faint reflections swallowed by blackness. The screeching stopped abruptly, replaced by a deep, rhythmic thudding that echoed through the room. It sounded like a slow, deliberate heartbeat, each pulse shaking the floor beneath me. The desk trembled, the notebook shifting on its surface as though trying to move. The scratches on the desk glowed faintly, their jagged edges forming words I couldn't read. The mirrors around me brightened. Flames danced in the reflections, their edges flickering wildly as shadows moved within them. Shapes twisted and writhed in the fire, their outlines impossible to define. I turned toward the doorway, but it was gone. The walls had closed in behind me, leaving no escape. The mirrors reflected nothing but the fire, their surfaces alive with heat and motion. The heartbeat grew louder, shaking the room with each pulse, and the shadows and the flames began to move toward me. The notebook snapped shut on the desk, which echoed like a gunshot. The fire in the mirrors flared brighter, and the shadows within surged forward, spilling out into the room. Gasping, I stumbled back, my chest tightening as the heat washed over me. The last thing I saw before the darkness swallowed me was the reflection of my own face in the glass, staring back at me with someone else's eyes. The room vanished, replaced by darkness so dense it seemed to cling my skin. I reached out, searching for walls, a door, anything solid, but my hands met only emptiness. The air carried the faintest smell of char, mixed with something damp and rotting, and each breath felt like inhaling smoke. I couldn't see the mirrors anymore, but their presence lingered, as if they were still watching, hidden just beyond the darkness. The spongy ground beneath me shifted. Every step squelched faintly, and I stopped moving. A light appeared ahead, flickering like a dying bulb. It barely illuminated the space around it, but it was enough to pull me forward. The light hung over a small desk, identical to the one I'd left behind. It was battered and scarred, with deep scratches running across its surface. The notebook was there, placed neatly in the center, as though it had never moved. Next to it, the locket I had thought lost rested in perfect stillness, its surface glinting faintly in the dim glow. The sight of it sent a cold wave of recognition through me, its significance somehow heavier. I stepped closer, my shoes sinking in with each step. The ground felt wrong, like damp earth mixed with something thicker. The desk seemed farther away than it should have been, but I reached it eventually. My fingers brushed the locket's surface first, and a faint warmth radiated through my skin. It was the warmth of something alive, something watching. The scratches on the desk shifted and writhed into words as I tried to read them, but one word stood out clearly: choose. My chest tightened, and I pulled my hand back from the locket. The glow from the letters pulsed, matching the faint rhythmic thud I could hear in the distance. Behind the desk, a shape emerged from the darkness. It wasn't a person, not entirely. Its outline shifted constantly, like smoke trying to hold a solid form. Its presence made the air colder, and I couldn't breathe deeply without choking on the thick air. The shape leaned forward slightly, though it had no face to speak of, and a voice came from everywhere at once. The words were in my head, clear and sharp, cutting through my thoughts. They told me I had a choice to make, though no details followed. The notebook glowed faintly on the desk, the light above flickering faster and casting erratic shadows across the space. The locket around my neck, however, was different. It pulsed faintly, almost in rhythm with the voice, as if it was alive and tied to the decision I was being forced to make. I opened the notebook again, though my hands trembled. The pages were blank except for the last one. The writing was faint but legible, and the letters were carved into the paper instead of written. They repeated the same word: stay. The voice in my head grew louder, repeating the same command, layering over itself until it became a roar. My hands gripped the edge of the desk, nails digging into the wood. The word carved into the desk pulsed again. The ground beneath me shifted, and I realized I wasn't standing on earth anymore. It was something alive, something breathing, its rhythm matching the thudding heartbeat in the distance. I tried to step back, but the ground held me in place, gripping my feet with an unseen force. The light above grew brighter, almost blinding, and the voice in my head quieted for a moment. The silence was worse than the noise. It felt purposeful, as though it was waiting for me to act. My locket seemed to hum, drawing my gaze. I reached for it, though I didn't want to. My fingers trembled as they touched its surface, and the warmth spread through my hand like fire. The voice returned, louder this time, demanding I choose. My chest tightened, and the ash smell grew so thick I thought I might suffocate. When I opened the notebook again, the words on the final page had changed. They were sharper, more deliberate, cutting through the paper like scars. Sacrifice. Escape. They. The locket pulsed against my palm, and I opened it, fighting back tears as I gazed at the picture of my mother inside its heart-shaped frame. The choices were simple, but the weight behind them pressed against me like a physical force. The voice in my head whispered the options, slower, as if savoring them. The glow from the desk grew stronger, and the scratches on its surface formed a new word: choose. The notebook pulsed in my hands, its heat unbearable, but I couldn't let go. The ground beneath me trembled, the breathing sound louder, more erratic. The shape in the darkness leaned closer, its presence overwhelming, and I knew whatever choice I made would change everything. The light above flickered one last time before going out completely. The darkness swallowed me, and the voice roared in my head, louder than before, demanding a decision. My hands gripped the notebook tighter, the locket still burning in my palm, and the words on the page burned themselves into my mind, leaving no room for thought. I had to choose. The ground beneath me shifted, forcing me closer to the desk, and my body acted on its own, driven by a force I couldn't resist. The mirrors on the walls flickered to life again. Flames danced on the other side, their edges sharp and wild, casting shadows that twisted unnaturally. Shapes moved within the fire, distorted figures that writhed and clawed at the air. One by one, small figures turned toward me, their faces void of features. A new shape emerged in the flames, more solid than the others. It was on its knees, hunched forward, and its movements were slow, deliberate. My chest tightened as I recognized the form. My mother. Her face wasn't right. The features were familiar but warped, like a reflection in broken glass. Her eyes burned and were empty, dark holes that drew in the light around them. Her mouth moved silently, and though no sound escaped, the voice in my head grew louder. The words were hers, though twisted and wrong, layered with the same unnatural tone from before. The locket burned against my skin, its heat radiating up my arm, and I couldn't tear my gaze away from her. She stared back at me from every fragment of the mirrors, each image more distorted than the last. The flames grew brighter, licking at the edges of the glass, and the heat in the room became unbearable. I wanted to run, but the ground held me in place, pulling me deeper into its grasp. The voice in my head shifted, its tone colder, demanding. It offered me the choice again. Sacrifice. Escape. Stay. The words echoed, filling every corner of my mind until I couldn't think of anything else. My gaze dropped to the desk, where the notebook sat, motionless, its pages blackened and smoking. Involuntarily, I reached for the notebook. My hands trembled, and my chest tightened as I lifted the cover. The page was empty except for one word, burned deep into the paper. Stay. The locket in my other hand pulsed violently, and I dropped to my knees, its heat searing into my skin. My vision blurred, and for a moment, I thought I might collapse. The mirrors shattered. The sound was louder than anything I'd ever experienced, but it came with no relief. The fire spilled into the room from the mirror's surfaces, consuming everything in its path, and circled the desk instead. The locket glowed brighter, its surface splitting open, spilling ash onto the scorched ground. Inside wasn't the picture of my mother anymore. It was a reflection of my own face, warped and hollow. The sight of it made my chest tighten as the ground beneath me surged. My mother's image appeared in the flames again, her face twisting into something unrecognizable, her dark eyes boring into mine. The voice in my head spoke one last time, its tone final and unyielding. You belong here. The fire surged forward, engulfing me entirely. My body didn't burn, but the heat consumed everything else. The locket disintegrated in my hand, its ashes swirling in the air before disappearing completely. My mind fractured, breaking apart piece by piece, until nothing remained but the voice. It was everywhere, surrounding me, filling every thought, every breath. Flames flared all around the room, encircling the desk. With my feet planted on her charred, spongy remains, I was stuck, helpless, watching my mother burn and scream in never-ending misery. Story number 4. It was never going to be him. I was with him as he sat in a hospital bed. I was with him as he was lowered into the ground. And I was with him as I gave him flowers every week. So, I knew it was never going to be him. But love makes us do illogical things. Grief of love especially so. We fell in love with each other fast. It was in the second year of college. Dylan was the charming bartender who could get any number, and I was the waitress who flirted with anyone to get large tips. Yet, despite that, we fell for each other. And we fell hard. We couldn't spend a moment away from each other, with every night being a date and every weekend being a small road trip to neighboring cities. Everything we did was together, and everything we were was each other. After college, we obviously moved in together, and it wasn't a month later that Dylan got down on one knee and I said yes. The wedding was nothing extravagant, just our close family and friends in an old chapel outside the city. The peeling white paint and earwig-infested wood was all a part of the charm for us. We didn't need a spectacular venue. We just needed each other. Because we loved each other. Even after the wedding, our honeymoon phase never ended. We still loved each other just as much as the day we met, even until the end. The letters started about 6 months after we had gotten back from our honeymoon trip. Dylan had just gotten transferred into a new position at the software company he worked at in the neighboring city. Too far to commute, and too close for us to unearth our life. I had just gotten a promotion at the hospital where I was working and didn't want to move. And Dylan, being the amazing husband he was, assured me that everything was going to be fine. The position was hybrid, only requiring him to be away a week of every month, and with his new salary, he could easily rent out a small apartment to use during that time. Still, I worried. To have such periods apart from each other so soon after our wedding. Perhaps we were a little codependent, but it was no problem. So that's how the letters started. The letters from my Dylan. During the last week of every month, Dylan would send me a letter updating me on what he was up to during the week he was away. With every note also professing his unending love and how much he missed me. We still did phone calls, of course, and more often than not, he would arrive back home before the letter did. We'd then read them together in bed, with me wrapped in his arms. It was so nice. Dylan had a fascination with the antique romance of posting a letter to me. He even thrifted an old typewriter that he kept in his apartment away from home that was solely dedicated to sending our love letters. Its brass keys corroded with age, containing small misalignments like the E key being slightly raised when compared to every other character in the sentence. Dylan even aged all the paper and envelopes to give it a more authentic feel, adding a cherry red seal on top of every letter, stamped with our initials in a heart. It was cute, and it felt like I was the Juliet to his Romeo. Of course, that story also ends with a tragedy. It was the weekend before Christmas when he was driving back from his last week away. The route he took home used backstreets through farmlands and forests, with only the faintest signs of civilization being seen. The rotten wooden fences lining each side of the road encased rarely seen cows. There were no streetlights and very few stop signs, which allowed Dylan to quickly get home. But most importantly, he passed by the old chapel that we got married in. It had been several years since then, with the chapel falling into disarray and abandonment. The antique and vintage feel that Dylan so loved now falling into rot and decay. Still, he loved to drive by it. I won't go into detail about the accident, just that it was dark and the squall of snow that night only allowed for a few feet of vision. When the hospital I worked at called me and told me to come, I did without a second thought. I knew he wasn't going to make it, but we still spent all of our moments together just as we always had. Dylan even left me one last letter to be read the week after he was gone. A final profession of his love and a goodbye, stamped with the same cherry red seal that contained our initials in a heart. The grief hit me hard. It still hits me even now, especially with everything that has happened. Packing up the apartment he had was the worst part. The place was barren with only the basic necessities with the exception of the writing desk. It was a testament to us. Framed photographs of our wedding day littered the large mahogany. Dozens of stacks of yellowed paper and jars of red wax reminded me of his scent. Then there was the typewriter, its dark body and brass keys well oiled and cleaned of any dust. I am not ashamed in the least to admit that I cried the entire night as I packed it all into boxes. It was a month after Dylan had passed when I found the next letter on the welcome mat of our front door. It was gently placed right in the center, facing the door with its red seal. Originally, I didn't think anything was amiss. I even smiled as I picked it up and brought it inside to be read. I thought it was simply one of his letters that had been delayed in arriving. Even reading the letter, nothing was strange at first. It wished me a Merry Christmas and expressed that it was excited to see me soon. It distinctly ended with, "Until death do us part, Dylan." I thought it was a kind of check-in with me to make sure I was doing well as he was away. I was wrong. Then the next letter arrived. Same time as the others, at the start of every month. No matter how struck with grief I was, I could think logically, and I knew something was wrong. However, there seemed to be nothing strange with the letter. It detailed what it had been doing in the last week, telling me that it was working hard for me and that it was excited to see me soon. It professed its love and signed using Dylan's name, "Until death do us part." I wanted to throw the letter in the garbage. I knew there was nothing connecting this letter to Dylan. Even so, it was so nice to hear its words telling me how loved I was. So, I couldn't throw it away. Still, I questioned how it could be happening. It was written on the same aged paper that Dylan exclusively used, and the small details in the keys of his typewriter were still present. I even suspected that Dylan's materials had been stolen, but when I frantically checked the boxes in the basement, everything was as it was supposed to be. The next month, the letter arrived again, gently placed at the front door. This time things were seemingly a little more honest. It actually assured me slightly. It addressed my worries, that I was probably confused, that it still loved me and was doing everything it could to be with me. And it told me things that only Dylan would know. Little details about our wedding, whispers only we shared in phone calls as he drove home from work. It was stupid, but it actually made me a little convinced that he was sending me these letters. Like I said, love makes us do stupid things. So, I kept the connection going. At the start of every month, I would read a letter from my dead husband. It wasn't good for my grief. It delayed the process. I knew it was unhealthy, but I couldn't let go. I kept reading the letters, happy that my husband had somehow come back in some form. However, Small things began to spoil that happiness. It always starts with the small things. At first, it was the constant insistence that it was excited to see me again soon. In every letter, it would insist that we would meet face to face soon. It unnerved me, but thought ultimately that it was similar to how people reassure those in grief that they eventually be with their loved ones again. Still, the Dylan in the letters repeatedly told me that we would be with each other again. It told me that it loved me and would not stop until we could be together. They also rarely spoke of our time together or how we had met. When they did, only alluding to vague details and the day of our wedding. Details that repeated themselves in different ways but were still limited to a small few. At some point, I also noticed that none of the letters contained any form of postage. No address to return to the sender and no address to which to be sent. This prevented me from ever being able to send my own letter to him. It was as if the letters were being hand-delivered to my door, but I was never able to capture the exact moment they arrived or how they did so. Then there were the letters themselves, wherein before they would be tastefully aged using some of my and Dylan's favorite teas to ensure the smell persisted on the page. The letters were slowly arriving yellowed and stained. They smelled sickly sweet and had an oily grime that stuck to my fingers and stained them a cigarette yellow. I could even see what seemed to be fingerprints imprinted on the stains and oil that were present before I held the letter myself. The red seal on the front had browned to resemble a dirty sanguine color with the initials hardly visible. And most importantly, the ink that the letter was written in was a brownish smearing substance that smudged at little contact. The clean writing that professed its love for me was rotten. I went down to the basement once, where Dylan's writing supplies were being kept just to see and couldn't bear to look inside the mildew and leaking boxes. That's also when the sickness started. I didn't connect it to the letters, I couldn't, but I began to slowly deteriorate in health. At first, it was a cough. Phlegm and mucus filled my lungs and throat, clinging to my insides and cloying at every breath. Then my body started to be feverish. My skin leaked sweat at all hours regardless of temperature, taking on a feverish jaundice yellow color which was accompanied by a musty scent that mixed horribly with my constant attempts at treatment with deodorant and soap. With every new letter, it felt like my condition only worsened, as if they were poisoning me. But I couldn't go without them. Even as my fingers and toes started to blacken and leak from gangrene, I couldn't possibly connect it to the letters. I didn't think Dylan would hurt me and thought the same of the letters. I was so weak I had to quit work, but at least I had my letters and their love for me. It was a little over a year after they began that the letters asked me to meet them, face to face. At first, I believed they meant the graveyard where Dylan was buried, which I visited on multiple occasions, but that wasn't it. The letters told me that it was possible for us to see each other again in the flesh. It stressed that very explicitly, that we could see each other in the flesh. So, I drove out to the old chapel where we got married. It was dark on the road, and the frozen rain that pelted the ground filled potholes with ice and slush. The spring melt had just begun, leaving behind the pristine white landscape and replacing it with a dirty brown slurry of slush that brought with it the smell of all the decaying nature that was buried beneath the ground for an entire season. When I finally arrived at the chapel, it was no different. The building was a far sight from when we had gotten married. The wood was rotting through, and there was no cross. The front door was open, though, inviting me in. And so, I went. It's a small building, only a single room filled with pews and an altar at the front. So, there was nothing blocking me from seeing the yellowed papers covering every wall and the man standing at the back of the church, barely visible in the darkness. It was Dylan. It looked like Dylan. It looked exactly like Dylan, as I had seen him last. It waved me over with Dylan's broken arm and smiled at me with his mouth full of missing teeth. It wore the suit he was wearing the day I had married him and buried him. It wore the face I loved and looked at me with eyes that were not the color of my husband's. I wanted to leave right then, but the idea of turning my back away from Dylan terrified me. I don't know if it was the fear of never seeing Dylan again or the fear of what the thing wearing Dylan would do to me that terrified me. Then it coughed out in a voice that didn't resemble my husband, in sickness and in health, and I ran as fast as I could until I couldn't hear it laughing behind me from the old chapel. I eventually limped to a farmer's house in the dead of night where they called me an ambulance. I was admitted to a hospital, where my colleagues looked at me with such concern and pity. I was so sick, So many different viruses and toxins in my system. I don't even know how I'm alive. I left my car at the chapel, but I'm too terrified to go back for it. To confirm what I saw, to see Dylan again. I've been released from the hospital, but the letters won't stop coming. It's every day now. I haven't opened them, but I don't know how to stop them. I've tried the postal service, but they aren't delivering them. Does anyone know what I can do? Does anyone know what's happening? Please, I don't know where else to ask. The letter said, "Until death do us part," and I'm scared it might be for both sides.